I discovered something about SetApp. Mike,
Yeah, what's that? That it's awesome?
MindNode is a part of SetApp.
Yes, it is. I'm so excited. I honestly was blown away when they said that they added that because there was already, I think, iThoughts is in there.
Yeah,
which is kind of like the power user one. And I'm like, there's no way they're going to add MindNode because it's too similar. There's too much overlap there, but they did. And I am very happy.
I have an article that I'm working on for my blog that's quite long, kind of deviates from my normal topics, but I felt like I just needed to like outline a whole bunch of stuff. And as I started writing things like, well, I want to move that around and I want to move like, and then it occurred to me, it's like, come on, Joe, Mike talks about MindNode all the time. I should go buy MindNode and because I don't own it. And then it occurred to me, like, wait, before you buy software, you're supposed to check SetApp first. Like, this is what you should do in the world that we live in today. So I pulled up SetApp, typed in, I think it was like MI, and it pops up MindNode. What? What is this magic? I click install, and I open the app, and I go to town. Like, that was a moment of wizardry for me.
Yeah, it's awesome. There's really no reason not to have a SetApp subscription anymore. They keep adding tons of new stuff. I don't think you could buy a new Mac today and just use the Apple stuff. Some people maybe could, but if you are the type of person that would not work for you, there is a very good chance that you could just buy a new Mac and a SetApp subscription and nothing else because there's so much good stuff in there.
Good friend of mine recently started a new job, and as part of that has a Mac, and I told her, like, sign up for SetApp, use everything you can from that, and if you feel that SetApp is not filling your needs on something, shoot me a text. I have not heard from her since. So,
and by the way, shout out to Eugene, who we met at MacStack,
yes,
who is SetApp.
Yes.
Well, he and other people, of course, but we both got some SetApp swag when we met him.
Yeah, I have this really cool SetApp pin. I'm super stoked about that. So, and we should mention SetApp is not sponsoring this show. We're just both enamored by it.
We just both really like it. And really the tie into Bookworm, obviously, is the MindNode stuff, which I talk about all the time. And quick plug, I guess, for the premium membership, if you want to download those MindNode files, they are in the club. Well, the PDF versions of the files. Someone had asked for the MindNode file, and I did an experiment. I don't think it's going to work through the cloud links that I use for the PDFs.
Okay.
Because it's kind of like a package file with the images and stuff.
Right.
But I did send it via Dropbox public link. I don't want to do that for everything. So I'll throw it out there for people who are premium members. If you do want the actual MindNode files, you can contact me directly in the Bookworm Club and I'll send them to you. But I don't want to just make a habit of uploading every single MindNode file that I do to the club. It's a bit more work, but happy to do it if people really want it.
Sure. Well, we didn't plan to do plugs for SetApp and MindNode, but that just happened. So let's step into outline mode. Mike, did you try more stuff?
Oh, did I try stuff? Okay, so as we're recording this, earlier this week, I went to hang out with the rest of the Blanc media team.
Cool.
And got to hang out for, well, it was there basically Monday late afternoon through Wednesday early afternoon. And one of the things that we did, which is definitely new stuff for me, is we went rock climbing.
Nice.
So a little bit of context here. I have never gone rock climbing. I have never wanted to go rock climbing. I am scared of heights. So I went along with it, and kind of in the back of my head, I forgot about this action item, but kind of in the back of my head, I'm like, it'll be fine, and I should push myself to try something new. So I did. And we did the tall walls at this place. And this place, it was a lot bigger than your average rock climbing gym. I think they had like 30 something of these tall walls, and then they had like the bouldering stuff. And this is all new to me, but apparently like there's a whole bunch of different versions of rock climbing, and they had everything.
Right.
So we did the tall walls, and they have these auto belays. So like you hook up and then you climb, and then the auto belay will, like when you disconnect from the wall, it will catch you, but there's a little bit of a gap before it catches you. So I did not test the auto belay before I climbed the first wall.
Oh, that is awesome. I love that you didn't test it.
And I got to the top and I'm like trying to test it a little bit, but I couldn't, while still holding on to the wall, disconnect enough for it to catch. So I got to the top of the first wall and I could not let go. But eventually I got it. And then after that, it was awesome. The last one I did, I think it was a 40-foot wall. Going back and looking at their website, it was like the tallest one in there. And they have obviously different difficulty levels from 5.6, I think, is like the easy level. And then it goes up to like 5.12 or something, 5.11, I think.
Okay.
The last one that I did, I believe, was a 5.8. So kind of in the middle. And definitely pushed my non-existent rock climbing skills to the limit, but I made it. And I got home and I found myself like Googling rock climbing gyms to see if I could find something close by that I could do it again. Turns out there's nothing within an hour of me.
Of course.
Anything good within an hour of me. But yeah, so I definitely did try more stuff, I guess. And turns out I liked it.
Nice. I'm proud of you, Mike. Well done.
Thanks. Unfortunately, I was too terrified at the time to even think about having somebody take a picture of me so I would have proof of this, but I did indeed go rock climbing.
Well done, sir.
Thank you.
Well, I will say you succeeded in trying more stuff then. I had one follow-up action item, and that was to set intentions for homeschooling. It turns out this is a lot harder than we thought, or at least than I thought. And in the midst of conversations about it with my wife, we're probably about a third of the way through that discussion, but it's kind of an ongoing thing. Every once in a while, we'll stop and we'll have a conversation about it. One of those is very likely to happen this afternoon because we're going mushroom hunting together, just the two of us, date night in the woods. That'll be fun.
That sounds like the ultimate Hobbit date night.
It does. It does. I posted a picture earlier this morning about of a mushroom that I took a picture of, and somebody wisely commented that, hey, that's a brightly colored mushroom. Aren't brightly colored mushrooms usually something you want to avoid? Yes, in fact they are. This one remained where I found it. It was simply a photo opportunity, and it was nothing more than that. That was not a dinner mushroom by any means.
All right.
So we're in the midst of these homeschooling intentions conversations. They will continue. Can't really say that they're the type of thing I could report on, but I can say that I am successfully going through this action item.
Awesome.
There you go.
All right. One more thing, I guess, real quickly before we get into the book. It's been a while since we mentioned the iTunes reviews, and I want to just call this out because I looked at them before we started recording, and I noticed that we did have more reviews than the last time that I had checked, which honestly was weeks ago, maybe months ago. And then I noticed also that the number of 1-star reviews has gone up. And
which at that point, my thought was, yes, we're winning.
Yeah. So this is interesting because your initial reaction is, oh, people don't like my thing. But then I thought about it a little bit and I realized that the reason that we typically get those 1-star reviews is because you or I either rail on a book that somebody else has recommended.
Yep.
It probably happened with the 4-hour work week, to be honest.
It was probably either the 4-hour work week or Getting Results the Agile way.
Yeah, true. It could have been Getting Results.
It was probably one of those two.
Yeah. But I also know, interestingly, that when we rail on books, it's also when the download numbers tend to go up.
Yep.
So people want us to pick on books. People don't want us to pick on books. I mean, make up your mind.
I figure we just pick the ones we want to read.
The takeaway here is just, we're going to keep doing what we do. But I do want to say thank you to the people who do take time to leave a review. It does help us out. And, I don't want to make it sound like we're completely dependent on those types of things. But the truth of the matter is that there is a mystery algorithm that iTunes uses, and iTunes is where most people listen to podcasts. So if you go leave a review, that works the algorithm, and there's a better chance that other people can find it. And likewise on Overcast, which is actually like a surprisingly large percentage of our users. Libsyn tells us just basically what app they use to listen to it. and a lot of people use Overcast. I do this for all the podcasts that I listen to. If I really like an episode, I just hit the star icon at the bottom. I don't even know how Marco computes it anymore, but I do know that Overcast does a really great job of showing me recommended episodes based on people that I used to follow on Twitter. It's not how he does it anymore, but basically like people who listen to this sort of thing helps them find other stuff. So not just Bookworm, but if you really enjoy a podcast, there's little things you can do to help the producers of said podcast. So
right.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, that said, let's step into today's book, which is Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, who was the president of Pixar. Still is?
To be honest, I don't know. I was under the assumption that he was, but I haven't looked.
Yeah. I that came out of my mouth, and then I realized, wait, I'm not actually certain of that. I'm pretty sure he's still the president of Pixar and now head of Disney Animation as well. So this book is quite different than what we would normally do for Bookworm. Its primary purpose is a story of Pixar and how it became what it is. But in order to tell that story, he has to share like the business principles and the relationship principles and the creativity principles that they had to follow and develop over 10, 20, 20 years now? Almost 20 years?
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in that range. Over that amount of time, they've had to develop a lot of just general ways of operating as a company in order to protect the creativity that they have with their films. And this, I feel, is a very fascinating journey to go on, because if you can extract those principles and learn how to apply those, I feel that it would be extremely helpful. But it's also just a fascinating history of the journey that Ed and John Lasseter and the team at Pixar have gone through to continually hit number one in the box office over and over and over again. Everybody has their favorite Pixar movie, and it's a thing in and of itself. They just continue to have hit after hit. And this explains why to a large degree. So I really enjoyed this book. It was a good read, even though it is quite a bit different. I have no idea how I'm going to rate this, so I got to figure that out while we talk here.
Yeah, when I read the first chapter, it starts with a story of like how they picked a different format for the conference table in one of their rooms. And then it kind of goes into the Ed Catmull story. And at that point, I was thinking to myself, Joe, what did you get us into?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I had the same thoughts. Like, what did I do?
Yeah. I'm not sure if I would say that I wish that hadn't been there. Like, I guess, when we read books, the tendency based on our Bookworm perspective is to nitpick all the little things that we would change or we didn't really like. And while the Ed Catmull story really felt like, at the beginning anyways, like we were a little bit duped, like this isn't what I signed up for. And maybe in that context, it's a little bit dry or not interesting. Not saying that Ed Catmull is not interesting, but like it's the kind of thing you would find in a biography. And
right.
I picked up this book not expecting a biography. So it was a little bit of a shock through the first couple chapters as he's basically telling his life story. There are some interesting anecdotes in here. I really don't care who Ed Catmull's two childhood heroes were. That kind of stuff is like, well, okay. But it is kind of cool to know that he was the one behind really the first computer animation, that hand thing that he made in 1973.
Yep.
And that kind of sets the stage for like what his interests and passions really are. I don't think we need to get into a whole lot of the details here. I'll try to summarize this. So basically, he grew up wanting to do computer animation, really liked the concept of animation, really liked technology, tried to combine those things in a time when it really wasn't a thing, and went to University of Utah, I believe, which I thought was interesting. Yep. Like, that doesn't seem like the cutting edge technology powerhouse, but basically that's the program there kind of was. From there, he went and joined this agency in New York, then worked with George Lucas, And while he was there, some Disney animators showed up. One of them was John Lasseter. He ended up getting fired by Disney a little bit later. They stayed in touch. And then they started working with Pixar and eventually Steve Jobs, which kind of leads into the other thing that I think people might expect from this book is a description, a very long, detailed description of what it was like to work with Steve Jobs. And while there is some of that stuff in there, the majority of this book, I think, is talking about their systems and their processes, the things that they did right, and also some of the mistakes that they made, the things that they learned, and how they tried to fix them. So it's more of a Pixar management biography than anything else, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and I think it makes a lot of sense to do it that way because, I'm with you. I don't really... The beginnings of Pixar through Ed Catmull's story, I struggled with that side of it, but at the same time, I think you have a tendency to start criticizing books earlier in the reading process than I do.
I do.
That's something I've noticed whenever I talk to people who are in the middle of reading a book. Do they have a tendency to try to figure out what they think about it in the midst of the introduction, or do they wait until after chapter 1? I'm more of a wait till chapter 2 or maybe even 3 type of person. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I feel like you start doing that in the introduction, which I'm not sure there's a right or wrong on that process, but is that fair?
Well, the red flag went up in the introduction, and then chapters 1 and 2 just confirmed it.
Yeah.
And then even chapter 3, we're starting to get into the Pixar stuff. And again, I'm not sure that you could remove any of this because it kind of is foundational for some of the stuff that he alludes to later. But at the time, I'm thinking, when is this going to get rolling? And it really wasn't until chapter 4, in my opinion, with the story of the Toy Story 2 disaster, which is my terminology, not theirs, but it was kind of a crisis moment. And if that had gone the other way, Pixar probably doesn't exist.
Right. Well, going back, the Ed Catmull story, because it took a while to tell that story, I had started judging it somewhat by the time I got to the end of it. And although I understand his story is, it's an interesting story, but I couldn't quite figure out why it was there. He essentially has a journey of wanting to create the first 100% animated, computer animated film, feature-length film. That was the goal. Toy Story, the original Pixar film, was the culmination of that 20-year journey of Ed Catmull.
Mm-hmm.
Post Toy Story, though, he has a crisis because now he has succeeded in his 20-year goal and wants to figure out what comes next. And it takes him a year to realize that the development of the creativity culture in Pixar is his next mission and protecting that.
Yep.
So that's really what he goes through and is, I think, this is my speculation, I think the reason he shared that was to point out the purpose of the book and show that, yes, this is something that he is passionate about in the development of the company of Pixar. And I think there's a lot of credibility to give to him as a result of that story, even though it felt a little out of place when it happened.
Yeah.
I think it did advise the rest of the book without it being explicit.
Well, I get it. Once you've read through it, you can understand why it's there. But when you're going through it, your perspective is a little bit different because he's basically telling you all the cool stuff that he did.
Right.
And if you were sitting down with somebody in a room, meeting them for coffee, dinner, whatever, and they just talk for the first 30 minutes about all of the things that they've done, your initial impression is, well, this guy's full of himself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what he does is I don't think that anymore after going through it. But the first time that you're going through it, you're like, well, what what is this? This isn't what I signed up for. And you're looking for an opportunity to leave. And with Bookworm, there is no opportunity. You just push through and you talk about it. But the average person, I could totally see them saying like, well, this Ed Catmull guy, I don't really care. Like, these are the kinds of things that maybe your family is really interested in. I've been in those situations, those conversations with people who can tell a good story. And sometimes they're sharing all these details and they're necessary to the story. They come back and they touch on them later. And in the moment, it's like, okay, when are you going to get to the part that I really want to hear? That's kind of what this is like. Sometimes they just never get there. Sometimes you leave the conversation and you're like, well, this person just likes talking about themselves. I kind of had an experience that a couple of weeks ago. So I don't want to go into the details here, but I walked away from it and I was just in a terrible mood. And my wife was like, what's your deal? And I was like, well, I didn't even realize that it impacted me this much, but really I just can't stand being around this person because they don't pay attention. It's all about them. And I realized that, like, I just don't like being around people like that. So as I started reading this book, I'm like, I don't like being around you, Ed. But
sure,
it's an unfair characterization because the rest of the book, like, he shared basically what he needed to. I don't feel like now that it was longer than it needed to be, but it did definitely take a little bit to get rolling.
Yeah, and that's fair. Now, one thing I want to point out about this book is it is not a 3-part book. It's a 4-part book, Mike. Which, as weird as it is, made me happy. It's like, thank you for being abnormal. I guess that's the story of Pixar, do things different.
Yeah.
But the whole thing kicks off with part 1, getting started, and he tells a brief history of Pixar. Now, this is kind of what we were talking about already. Yeah, it is kind of what we were talking about. It does delve into where Ed Catmull was working for Lucasfilm for a period, like where his whole beginnings of developing an animation company came from and how it moved from owner to owner and how it ended up in the hands of Steve Jobs. And the part that kind of got me in the midst of that was that at one point, Pixar, if I got the number right, it was either $54 or $56 million in the hole, in the red.
Yeah.
That dumbfounded me. And Steve Jobs bankrolled that personally. Jeez. Like that. Talk about a big hole to dig out of.
Right. And it wasn't the first time like that he tried to acquire the company either.
Right.
Because before he got let go by Apple and founded Next, he was trying to buy them. And then after he got let go, basically they lost contact with him. Eventually he contacted them again and wanted their technology because he wanted to build a killer personal computer. And they're like, no, that's not what we want to do. And then later on, he comes back to Apple and they get reconnected again. He's like, how are things going? Well, not so great. We're $56 million in the hole or whatever. And that's when he buys them. But at each step in the process, they're basically putting their flag in the ground and they're saying, no, we are dedicated to computer animation. That's what we are.
Right.
And there are 56 million reasons for you not to hold that position.
Right.
So I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. And it's a little bit different maybe because of my family dynamic. But I'm thinking to myself, would I really be willing to fight for this thing after I had lost $56 million in 1980s money? Like, I don't even know what that is worth with the inflation rate adjusted for today, but that is a really, really big hole that you don't know if you're going to be able to climb out of. So I don't know. I don't think I could be that sure that this is the thing it's going to take off. A lot of people have their passion projects, but at some point you have to come to the reality that your passion project may not be financially sustainable. Fortunately for us and all the other Pixar fans, like, they did stick with it and it did turn out okay, but there's definitely an alternate path here.
I can't say that whenever I crossed the 10 million in the hole mark that I would have kept going.
Yeah, exactly.
Even the, 400,000 in the hole. Wow. 50 plus million in the hole. Obviously that struck a chord with me. And I appreciate that they continued working on it, and I appreciate that they made it work, but holy buckets, they had a rough road getting there.
Yep.
Obviously, if you want to know this whole story, pick up the book and read it. He goes through a lot of detail. We're skipping a lot.
Yes.
But there is a large amount of passion that went into the building of Pixar, especially that went into the development of Toy Story, the very first. And they do tell the entire story behind Toy Story and how it came about and how Steve Jobs actually positioned their IPO for a week after Toy Story was to release and gamed the whole business side of things perfectly.
Yeah.
Like, that's classic Steve.
Smart dude.
And he basically made the company as a result of that move. So it's a fascinating history, but what happens then is after Toy Story, they released, I just blanked on the name of the film. What was number 2?
A Bug's Life.
A Bug's Life. Yep. So they released Toy Story, huge success, of course. They released A Bug's Life, and they had some bumps in the road, but they had a lot of success with that as well, which brings us to what Mike has termed the Toy Story 2 disaster. And I don't think it's a misnomer to call it that, because I think Ed Catmull would call it that, given his brutal honesty with the way that he phrases things. Like, he's like, that failed. Like, we had to, it completely fell off the tracks. We had to straighten it out.
Mm-hmm.
But they tried, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Mike, they tried to bring in new directors and some new people. They thought they had the process figured out. One of their mantras was trust the process. They had that nailed down, and they handed it over to some new folks. And in the midst of them doing a screening of it, they realized this is a disaster of a film. And they had to fire the folks in charge of it, the directors working on it, and bring in the original team that had worked on Toy Story, the original, in order to hustle, and hit their deadlines and have any success with it.
Yeah.
Did I get all that right?
Yes. So I'll add a little bit more detail. Basically, Toy Story 2 originally started as an idea from Disney, and they wanted to make a direct-to-video, lower quality release of Toy Story 2. They started working on it, and a couple months in, they came back and said, our standards are higher than that. We can't do this. They wanted to do a theatrical release. The problem at that point was that they were already working on A Bug's Life, which was John Lasseter's baby. So they had no experienced directors on Toy Story 2. They did have an experienced team, and they thought that the experienced team would be able to make up for the lack of experience from the directors. So John Lasseter and the A-team are working on A Bug's Life. That gets shipped. John checks in on Toy Story 2, and he's basically like, this is garbage. So he calls together the company, and he says, starting January 2nd, we're going to work really hard on this because we've only got, at that point, 9 months to save the film. And they kind of had to start over. Everyone ended up pushing really hard. And they came to the realization afterwards, even though the whole industry is kind of built on this, where there's these ebbs and flows of, like, you have to work really hard for these periods. Ed Catmull tells this story, which was kind of the clarifying point to him that this is absolutely not okay, and this is a sign that we were pushing people too hard. When one of their employees came in overtired, forgot to drop their kid off at daycare, their wife called them at work. He realized he had left the kid in the car, and it was really hot, and the baby ended up being okay, but like not a good situation. Obviously, something like that will scare you into thinking like things that aren't okay. Like, that's kind of a wake-up call. So they pushed Toy Story 2 out the door. They were able to actually release a sequel that did well and was not a garbage film. But then they kind of realize that they need to do things a little bit differently.
So I think that the piece in all of this that they learned was that you really need feedback, and they had to change that whole system to allow brutal feedback to directors and folks who are building those films, so that they don't fall off the rails like that. They learned a lot in that in the making of Toy Story 2, which led them into, which in the book is now part 2, Protecting the New. They built out this team, which they refer to as the Braintrust, and I love the concept of what they do with this, but this comes out in a chapter on honesty and candor. And what they do, see if I can get this right, because it sounds like an intense meeting that I don't really want to be a part of, but it sounds amazing given the results that they have from it.
Oh, I want to be there.
I know. It's one of those, I want to be on a fly on the wall, but I feel like I really don't want to participate.
I would love to participate. I feel like this is right up my alley.
So the idea here is that they have a rough form of the film. The group, which could be 10, 15, sometimes 20 people, other directors, other producers, other storytellers, they watch this, and then they go into a room, they grab something to eat. The director of the film pitches the idea to them, explains what they're doing, mentions the areas that they're struggling with, the ones they're excited about, the ones they feel they've nailed, and then John Lasseter typically kicks off with his thoughts on what worked and what didn't, and that starts a whole conversation that they just let go indefinitely until it's done about what they saw did and didn't work in the film. And the key here is that they have 100% candor in the process as opposed to honesty, which I get his difference in terms. I think the idea is just be real and tell the truth was his point. But the thing that they would do is say, this area didn't work, and I'm not really sure why, or they knew why. It's like, this was too harsh, that he was too hard on that character, this one wasn't working, that guy was too small in this scene, I didn't believe you on your main storyline. And they would do all of this back and forth, share a lot of thoughts with each other on it, and then it was up to the director to decide if they should accept or reject any and all of these ideas. And because of this Braintrust meeting, they are able to continually iterate and develop and build out a story that really rings true, as we can see with the huge amount of success with all the Pixar films that have come out. So, again, I think this Braintrust meeting is really interesting. I'm not really sure how to apply it to my life, other than, like, how does this... I could try to think through, how does this apply to our church to some degree, but we're not in a creative endeavor, really, so I don't really see how that could apply, but the concept behind the Braintrust is incredibly intriguing to me.
Well, I think the way to apply this is something like a mastermind group. And I actually had a meeting with my mastermind group this morning, so I think that the honesty versus candor, the difference there is most clearly seen in that sort of setting.
Okay.
And I guess just real briefly, for people who aren't familiar with the concept of a mastermind group, it's a bunch of people that you allow to tell you the truth, even if it hurts. So honesty, for example, every single person would say, yes, honesty is a good thing. You should be honest. Okay, so how do you honestly answer when your wife says, does this dress make me look fat? Okay, that's the problem. The candor is honesty with fewer moral connotations. It's forthrightness or frankness. So candor is just cutting to the quick, saying the thing, and not really caring what impact it's going to have on the other person because they've signed up for this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense.
So the Braintrust is kind of like this mastermind group. of people who are there to help you make your thing better. There is no selfish agenda here. So that's another thing that I think is kind of important to making this whole concept work. The people in the Braintrust initially were John Lasseter, Andrew Stanton, Pete Docter. That was the guy who did like Up and Monsters, Inc., I believe, Lee Unkrich, and Joe Ranft. And they were made up of people who, specifically Ed Catmull says, had a deep understanding of storytelling and no authority. The goal was to put all of these smart, passionate people in a room together and then charge them with identifying and solving problems and encouraging them to be candid with each other. I also think, I don't remember if I wrote this down, but the thing about this Braintrust and the notes that came from this was that the director had to change something. They didn't have to follow the advice that people had given them, but they had to make sure that their movie didn't stay the same. Because the theme that he talks about in this chapter is that all Pixar movies suck at the beginning. The goal is to get them from suck to not suck. So that's going to require a lot of revisions, a lot of changes.
Right.
They also outlawed Steve Jobs from these Braintrust meetings because they thought he would change the meeting.
Yes, that's true. I forgot that point.
I thought it was really interesting because they recognized right away that you get the wrong person in the room and the whole thing breaks. So I too thought about how can I create this sort of atmosphere in the different arenas that I'm involved in. And I think he talks about creating a Braintrust here. And there's a couple of things I wanted to call out. He makes a point that it takes a while for any group to become or to mature to the point where they could become a Braintrust, because it takes a while for any group to develop the level of trust which is necessary in order to really be candid. Also, the people in a Braintrust, and I would argue the people in a mastermind group, this applies to them as well, that they can't help people who don't understand the philosophies, so people who aren't willing to learn and grow, people who refuse to hear criticism without getting defensive, or maybe they just don't have the ability to digest the feedback and then make adjustments and start again. That is kind of a lot, but basically, if you're going to walk into a mastermind or a Braintrust type meeting like this, you got to know that it's going to hurt a little bit, but you got to recognize that it's going to benefit you in the long run. No pain, no gain.
Right.
And then the other thing I want to call out about this, and again, I think this applies to mastermind groups as well, is that they evolve over time. So the Braintrust, even if it's the same people at the beginning, is going to be different 3 years from now when you start this thing. And I think that's an interesting observation that can be scary to some people, but for growth-minded people, it shouldn't be, because you're going to be changing too. And as long as the goal of the group is to grow and your goal is to grow, that's really the thing that matters. There's going to be synergy there.
I think it was important for him to point out that these Braintrust meetings, this team, it wasn't something that you could set up and walk away from. It wasn't something that you can say, okay, every 3 months we're going to get together, have this meeting. This is the people who's going to be a part of it, and this is the format of how it's going to go. Turn it loose. He made it very clear that this setup is one that requires constant moderation and constant observation and leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to continually work at making sure people feel free enough to share their ideas, and that others aren't taking offense at critique of the story. At one point, he called out that I forget the exact phrasing. I'll have to look it up. But he mentions that, it's great for you to have ideas, but don't let your ideas become you.
Yes, you are not your ideas. If you identify too closely with your ideas, you will take offense when they are challenged.
Yes, that.
Which is why the 1-star reviews don't bother me, because I am not Bookworm. Bookworm is my idea, and I would like people to like it, but ultimately, that 1-star review is not a judge on my character.
Yes.
It's not my identity. The other thing here is that the candor, is not something that is optional, I believe. I think that, because he makes the point that lack of candor leads to dysfunctional environments. I have been in those places where I know what I should say, but I know I can't say it because the people who are there are not going to receive it well.
Right.
And the goal of candor is to essentially remove the emotion from the statement. But it's hard to do that in a lot of contexts. And if it's going to work, the feedback that you give has to be not emotionally charged. And that's one piece of it. So I can make sure that what I say is not emotionally charged. But kind of what I've learned the hard way is that it doesn't mean that the person I am communicating it to is not going to receive it as emotionally charged. And ultimately, that is my responsibility to make sure that they receive it correctly. Now, sometimes there's things you just can't do anything about. No matter what you're going to say, people are going to receive it wrong. So in those situations, I just don't say anything. Mama always told me, can't say something nice, don't say anything at all.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Like that's really the truth principle here. But I am finding myself also looking for situations, organizations, really everything that I do. I want to facilitate this, and I want this to be the goal. Now, some things have the potential to grow to the point where you can have candor, and like I said, it just takes time to get to that point. But if you're further down the food chain in a company where candor is not welcomed, like that's a red flag in my opinion, because it's just going to compound over time, and eventually it's going to have a negative impact when the thing that needs to be said is finally said and people blow up, or the company or organization continues to be ineffective because no one's willing to deal with the real problems that are there because they don't want to hurt people's feelings. Both of those situations are not good. So I guess my takeaway is try to align myself with people who prioritize candor.
Right. And I think there's a lot of benefit to being aware of the other person's ability to accept that feedback. It's, we all know people who, if you were to share, like, you're making a terrible choice in your life, they're going to flip over backwards and just lash out. Like, everybody knows someone like that. But I think that if you are conscientious of that and aware of how people can react to your feedback, and you convey the idea that you're open to people critiquing you, that, to me, that's a key component that made these Braintrust meetings successful, is that the director who was in charge of that film was open to the feedback. If he had not been open to the feedback, the whole thing could have fallen apart. And that was a very key component to the whole thing. So in the midst of conversations with other people and in the process of giving constructive criticism, if the recipient is open to that, that's where a lot of the value can come from. And that's what I think, as long as you and I are open to that, we're totally cool with people giving us 1-star reviews. Do I want that? No, of course not. But at the same time, I would much rather know that people don't care for it, and would really honestly like to know why.
Yep.
Like, if you don't like it, why don't you like it? Don't just tell me, oh, that's terrible. Like, well,
and really, if I could
sure.
rephrase that, don't tell me why you don't like it, but tell me what can make it better.
Correct.
What can we do differently? Not just to change so that we're more in line with somebody's preferences, but is there an underlying actual problem with how we are doing things? And is there a better way to accomplish our goals? That's the kind of thing that's valuable. And you have to tease out, because a lot of people will just complain and they'll say, I don't like that.
Correct.
Well, okay, I probably won't be able to fix that. For the person who says, you guys have too much religious undertones, it is who I am. I'm sorry, but it's a big part of my story. And I realize that, you and I, 1-star reviewer guy, because of that reason, like we probably won't be able to reconcile that. I would if I could, but there's just no way that I can make an authentic podcast and talk about these things in a meaningful way without being phony. And that feels phony to me because it is so ingrained in my identity. That's way more part of my identity than Bookworm is. So I'm not going to flip those.
Yep. All right. That said, he has a whole chapter here. We are skipping some chapters here, by the way. There's a lot. It was, how long is this, Mike? A little over 300 pages?
Just under, but there are 13 chapters. We could have tried to nail every chapter, but I felt like the 4 sections kind of lend themselves to tying a couple of these ideas together, and there's no need to go into every single chapter. The next chapter, though, is fear and failure, and it does tie into this honesty and candor piece. And the reason being that this whole idea of the brain trust and the candor and the honesty, I feel like one of the ways to really facilitate that is to talk about your own mistakes and your own failures as a leader, because it makes it safe for other people to do the same. And when everybody's talking about all the things that they've messed up, now to have something that's messed up is no longer a rarity. And the truth is that there's lots of stuff that we work on that's messed up. But if we pretend that it's perfect, then we can't fix it.
Yeah, he goes through a process about, like, he explains the general knowledge and wisdom that people share around failure, where, fail fast and get your failures out of the way so you can get to the successes. Like, that mentality is especially common in the world of software, and it's one that I think has permeated a lot of the business world at this point. But he also says, sure, those are fun maxims, but what do you want me to do about it? Like, I'm not going to go out and try to fail.
Yeah.
Like, that's obviously not what I'm going to do. But at the same time, he does call out that as you're trying to build something big and successful, you can simply make a decision about what you think is best and move quickly.
Yep.
And move towards it quickly. And if you learn that it's not the right path, change course and go elsewhere. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just a learning, and move on and head to what you think is the right direction. That was my main takeaway from it. But he does try to spell out, like, failure isn't all negative, but it is negative. So I did at least appreciate that.
The best analogy I have ever heard about this topic comes from this section. He's talking about Andrew Stanton, who's the guy who says, fail early, fail fast, be as wrong as you can. And he's not the one who originally came up with those ideas, but he's the one who he attributes them to in this book. But he also mentions that Andrew views failure like playing the guitar. And he says, you don't think real hard about where to put your fingers because you only get one chance to strum. I thought that was kind of brilliant, the way that they described that. As a guitar player, I mean, it's true. And I kind of fall into that mode naturally, where I, even with my limited ability to play the instrument, I can find myself not wanting to make a mistake, trying to avoid errors. And that's really what they're defining as like the negative view of failure. And it is something that they have to deal with after they merge with Disney down the road in section 4. But what really intrigued me about this section here is how to know if the company or organization that you're involved with has embraced a negative view of failure. He's got a couple different steps here. He says, ask yourself first, what happened the last time an error was discovered? Do people shut down and go inward, or do they come together to untangle the cause of the problem that it might be avoided going forward? And the acid test is, if the question asked is, whose fault is this? Then your culture vilifies failure. And if we're honest with ourselves, that probably applies in a lot of the cultures that we're associated with.
Yep.
And this is one of the lessons I learned in when I was working with the agent efficiency team. I think I've told this story before, so just real briefly, like a podcast episode got published early, and I was trying to dive in and figure out like who did this. Tan's like, doesn't matter. How do we figure it out so that it doesn't happen again? And that was a tipping point for me, and I want to continue to build that mentality in the different groups, companies, organizations that I'm involved with. But some of them have gotten it, some of them have not. And I can tell you that it's very refreshing for the ones that do understand this. It does feel very different. You know, he talks about how fear can be created quickly, but trust can't. I think this is really the key way that fear gets built, is if you have this mentality that if I make a mistake, people are going to blame me. There's going to be negative repercussions for this. People are going to feel, obviously, like they cannot afford to make a mistake. But trust is not assuming that somebody is not going to make a mistake. Trusting people means that when they make a mistake, you trust that they will act to also help solve it. They're not just going to walk away from it and leave a mess in your lap. That was interesting, that whole perspective as he defined it, because you can be building trust, and that takes a long time to do. And it only takes one instance of this is your fault, and that trust is broken, and now fear has taken its place. And I don't have a specific action item associated with this, but what it did show me is that I have to be very careful about building trust, because it only takes one slip up to destroy that thing that you've been trying to build.
Absolutely. I think there's, I noticed you wrote down an action item around this. The thing that I think is the most important with this is that, and you see this, I see it a lot in nonprofits, if you don't discuss the things you screwed up, people have a tendency to put you on a pedestal. They may still put you on a pedestal, but if you don't talk about your failures, you borderline become idolized in a way, because they see you as larger than life. And then if someone learns of a mistake or something that you didn't own up to, a failure that was hidden, now your entire character is at stake, not just that one thing.
Yeah.
So it's super important to talk about, I screwed this up, or this is something that I'm seeing that's not working well in our organization, and talk about it, because it can easily create long-term issues or completely destroy people or organizations if it's not talked about.
Yeah, and the action item that you're alluding to was simply to talk about my failures. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, obviously, we're talking about how I can change the culture of the different organizations that I'm involved with, and I do think that that is an important thing that I can do in different situations. But I also think that with the platforms that we have online being fairly visible, especially in the productivity space, there is so much emphasis on the gold standard, I guess. I don't know another way to describe it, but people are sharing all the things that go right, and they don't share any of the things that go wrong. And so if you just follow these people, you can feel really bad about your situation because you're not getting an accurate picture of what their life is really like.
Right.
All you're seeing is all the cool places that they travel and working from the beach, like the entrepreneur's dream sort of a thing. You don't see the long hours that they've got to put in before they get to that point. You don't see all the sacrifices that they made, and not that even those sacrifices have a direct correlation to you getting to that point. Like, just be real. Let's all just talk about what's really going on and not try to paint this picture so that we can sell something, which I feel like Bookworm, we've done a pretty decent job with that, because that's kind of been my ethos the whole time. Right or wrong, people who listen to this can judge for themselves, but that's at least been my goal as we have done this podcast, is I want to give people a realistic picture of the struggles and the things that we go through. But as I'm going through this section, I'm realizing that now more than ever, that is needed online.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's step into part 3, building and sustaining. And there's 2 points here we're going to jump into, one of which is research trips and postmortems. But this is a part of a broader list. What is it, 9 parts on that list, Mike?
There are 8, yeah. And I wrote them all down in my MindNode file. So if you're a premium member, you can get these.
Good job, Mike.
The things I do for the Bookworm Premium Club members. Now, so the whole list is really interesting. And the chapter this comes from is chapter 10, Broadening Our View. This list is the methods that they use to put their collective heads into a different state of mind. This is kind of building on a concept that we cut from the previous section for sake of time. I'll just real briefly talk about it. They've got this concept of the beast, which is kind of the thing you alluded to earlier, where they keep pumping out number 1 hits. And so the beast is basically, how do you keep this thing going? No one wants to make a mistake and publish a movie that doesn't end up at number 1. And then the ugly babies, that's the belief that everything that when you first create it, it is an ugly baby. And you have to fight to protect that thing at the beginning until it kind of finds its legs and evolves into the thing that it really can be, the potential there. And all of the movies that Pixar produces all start out as these ugly babies. The most interesting story I found was the story of how Up came to be. So Up is a really great movie. And I guess for people who haven't seen it, there's this old guy who his wife passes away. He made a promise to take her to Paradise Falls. And then the whole house like lifts up and he goes to this South American country with a whole bunch of helium-filled balloons. Pretty ridiculous, right? But the story originated as like this kingdom that was floating in the sky. And there were 2 princes who were very different and always fighting with each other. And they fell to the earth and they're trying to figure out how to get back up to this castle in the sky. Very, very different movie, right? And they said the only thing that made it from the original to the new one was there was this bird, Kevin, which is kind of like a minor character.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. So as that transformation is taking place, it requires a perspective shift and it requires that you look at things differently, which is where these 8 different things that they do kind of fall into play for me anyways. So research trips, this is basically if they're going to do a movie in a setting or on a topic, they will send a bunch of the crew to go do that thing or be in that environment. It ends up being very expensive, but the net result is that they catch a lot via osmosis just because they're there. So for example, Monsters University takes place at this like prestigious university. So they sent their teams to like Harvard and Yale so they could be in these prestigious universities. And even like the sounds that are in the library, like are influenced by being in that environment. So you may not have notes of, I noticed this thing while you're there, but then when you're back home and you're building this thing, you can tell if it feels right. And the interesting thing to me about this was that there really is no way to quantify the value of this, because when you do this and you present it to an audience member who maybe or maybe doesn't, most likely doesn't understand that domain or that environment very well, like they can't tell if that sound or that thing that you drew is accurate. But if you don't nail it, it doesn't feel right. It's almost like they can intuitively tell, even if they have no idea what's actually wrong, when something is wrong. And so he basically says that the net result is that when the team can nail this, the audience knows it and they're more engaged with the film, which was really interesting to me.
I think these are really important. But at the same time, you got to try to translate it, because I'm not going to write an article about how awesome it is in Africa and not go there. Like, that doesn't make sense. I wouldn't do that, but I'm probably not going to write that article either. But granted, they're also dealing with much, much bigger budgets and much higher margins on the return. So I get it, but I think there's a potential learning here in that if you are going to do a creative endeavor, do your research. Like, watch videos on it, watch documentaries on it, research it to no end. If you can go there, go there. If you can find people who work in a given sector and you need to know more about it, talk to them, read books about it. This is the classic collect dots concept before you can connect them later. And the more dots you collect, the better off your creative endeavor is going to be. To me, that's the real takeaway here, is if you're going to do something with high impact and with a lot of quality, do the background legwork. Don't just make guesses and speculate. Get detailed about it, because as Pixar has shown, that does have a huge impact in the long run.
Yep. And it's interesting because part of the problem that comes with that is that they spend too much time on the details. So, for example, the next one here, which isn't in the list we were going to talk about, but it's Power of Limits, they talk about the beautifully shaded penny. And the problem with this is that Pixar employees will spend a crazy amount of time on little details for the actual films, but they don't understand whether that thing is going to have any significant impact in the movie. So, for example, there's a scene that they share from Monsters, Inc., where the little girl knocks Mike Wazowski's CDs off of the case. Do you remember that scene?
I do.
Okay. So he says, oh, those were alphabetized. The whole scene is like 3 seconds, right? Each CD on that case, a Pixar employee created an album cover for, even though there's only a couple of them that you will see on the floor in Mike's apartment.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at that and they're saying, well, that was a waste. We didn't need that many covers made. On one level, it's kind of cool that they put that much attention and detail into things, but also obviously that makes the amount of effort to create the film much higher, and they're kind of always pushing up against these deadlines. So if you're looking for something to cut, that would be a great thing to cut. Let's just design the 3 we need instead of all of them. But they don't know how those things are going to be pieced together.
Right.
So
right.
Being able to see the limits of usefulness helps them conserve their energy and put it in the appropriate place.
Absolutely. But they also do postmortems, Mike.
Yeah, postmortems are cool. I love the idea of postmortems. I've done some of these, and they're always really valuable. Basically, a postmortem is a short meeting, and it could be after a project, but at Pixar specifically, it's after a film is released, where they explore what worked and what didn't work, and they attempt to consolidate all of the lessons that they learned from it. There's a couple reasons that they do this. Number one is, like I said, they want to consolidate what they learned in making this film. They also want to teach other people who maybe weren't there so they can avoid some of the mistakes maybe that they made. And the thing that was interesting to me is they don't want to let resentments fester. I think this is probably the most important piece to this, because if you are on a team that is pushing and you get this thing out the door, and then the initial reaction, if it's a successful film, which almost all Pixar films are, is like, hooray, we did a good thing, but you may resent the fact that this thing did, or your piece of it didn't really go the way that you wanted it to. You're caught up in the celebration because it was a monetary success. And then the next film that you work on, the same thing happens, right? And then you're like, oh, that's right. I was mad about this before. Now I'm even more mad that it's happening again. This is totally unjust. So
here we go again.
So just document that stuff, get it out there. And yeah, maybe it'll happen again. But I feel like if you have the ability and the avenue to share those things, you can release those things. So even if it does keep happening again, as long as you are able to express your frustration with the thing, you feel better about it. It's no longer something that you're holding on to and it continues to make you more and more bitter. You're able to let go and do your best creative work. I think that's a really important aspect to these postmortems.
Yeah, I mostly wanted to see, and again, as I go through, listeners, you know this, I have a tendency to try to extrapolate things out and go to, like, how do I apply this elsewhere? this is the same thing. How do I apply this to events at the church? How do I apply it to projects that I complete online or even articles that I write? How do each of those instances, what does a postmortem look like? I don't know that I have an action item around this one, Mike, or really what to do with it, other than I know these are good things to do, and I know they're valuable, but I haven't quite figured out what to do with it yet.
Well, I'll give you an example, a church example even.
Ooh.
So my wife and I lead the outreach team at our church, and we do a big outreach basically once a quarter. And after the outreach, we have a meeting with the rest of the church staff to do a postmortem. And we talk about what went well, what didn't go well. And we make a bunch of notes on things that we want to change for next time, because there's a good chance we're doing the same event a year from now, and we don't want to repeat the same mistakes. And all of those things get documented in a Google Doc. And when we're planning the next one, we look at that Google Doc and we say, oh yeah, we didn't want to have fruit in the summer because it just attracts the flies and the bees. So we're not going to do that when we cook up all the hot dogs and the brats and have the big community block party sort of a thing. So that's one place where that can be valuable. But I think, again, it comes back to the candor piece. Like, you have to take an honest look at the event itself, and you have to disconnect yourself from the event. If the event is a total bust, it does not mean that Mike and Rachel Schmitz are a total bust. And we have to be able and willing to hear the things that could have gone better.
You have a point in the outline, creativity and skiing. I don't know where you want to go with this one.
Sure. So chapter 11 is the unmade future, and it basically talks about creativity. And there's an analogy in here that I really liked of creativity and skiing. The point being that if you are skiing and you tighten up and think about it too much, you are going to crash. So in essence, trying not to crash actually makes you crash. So how does this apply to creativity? I think if you were to sit down and be like, I really need to be creative now, you're not going to be creative. You're going to crash. But when you can learn to relax, you can go faster and you can enjoy it. The phrase that they use for this is, if you think, you stink, which I am a thinker. So this definitely applies to me. I don't necessarily have an action item associated with this, but basically what I want to do is just let go and trust the process, kind of what they were talking about. One of the big main Pixar values at the very beginning. The other one, by the way, I don't think we mentioned this, is that story is king. So obviously that applies specifically to Pixar because they're telling stories, but you could apply that a lot of different situations as well. But specifically the trusting the process, I have long believed that everybody is creative. You may not think you're creative and then you would be right, but you have the ability to be creative. And if you try to force it, you may have trouble with it. And then you use that as reinforcement for the idea that you are not creative, if that makes any sense. He says on page 223 that in his experience, creative people discover and realize their visions over time and through dedicated, protracted struggle. So the fact that you are struggling does not mean that you are not creative. In fact, it's actually evidence that you are creative, because all creatives struggle with this stuff. You have to show up and you have to put in the effort. And really, the big thing that made a difference for me was not judging my work afterwards. I made the decision I was going to show up and I was going to write for an hour every day. That's how my book got published initially, or self-published initially, was that I just showed up and wrote. And at the end of the day, I published it. I wasn't going to sit there and edit it until it was perfect. Some days I sat down, I only typed out 100 words instead of 1,000. Didn't view that as a bad day, because at least I showed up. And I think that's the key piece here, is just show up, relax, and let it go. And then whatever happens, and that's okay.
Which is similar to how we both got started with Bookworm, in that we both wanted to read more, so we figured let's start a podcast so that we read more. And it's what I'm slowly coming to, is like, just start reading. But with creative endeavors, it's very similar. If you're going to read an entire book, or you're going to write an entire book, the principles are the same. Show up every single day, preferably at the same time, and do the work. whether it's 10 minutes, 10 hours, like show up and do the work. And that's something I've slowly been developing with my writings. Like I show up every day, write it at the same time. Same thing with the reading practice. Like these become habitual rituals that I go through on a daily basis. This is very similar in that if you give yourself the space, you don't put any restrictions on what you're creating or how much to create or how amazing it is. You're just giving yourself the space to, do the creative work itself.
Yep.
Now, I forget if it was Hemingway or somebody else that said, I only write when the muse strikes. Thankfully, it shows up every morning at 8 a.m. I think that's Hemingway.
Right.
Somebody like that. That's it. Show up. And if you show up every single day, slowly that mental state becomes normal.
This reminded me a lot of James Clear in Atomic Habits, because
absolutely,
he's not the one who came up with this, but he really hammers this idea of, so you want to be a writer, you got to write. What does a writer do? They write. What does a reader do? They read. What does a runner do? They run. So if you don't run, if you don't read, if you don't write, you cannot say that that is an identity that you've embraced. But if you show up and you run poorly, you can say, I am a runner, and you can continue to get better.
Yep.
If you show up and you read one page every day, you can say, I am a reader. If you show up and you write for 1 hour, even if it's only 100 words, you can say you are a writer. And the more that you do it, the better that you get at that specific thing. The thing that paralyzes a lot of people is making a value judgment on the thing right away. And I totally get that. You have to be able to view yourself as a beginner when you are a beginner. If I approached my running with the goal of running a half marathon, which I did, and then the very first time I ran, I could barely go 2 miles and I was like a 10-minute pace, I would have quit right there and be like, you're never going to be able to do this. Look at you. You're pathetic. But that's not how it works. You just do it over and over and over again, and it gets easier. And I believe that applies to your creativity as well.
Now, part 4, testing what we know. This goes back to some history in Pixar and a period of time when Disney, now keep in mind, I don't know if we've talked about this a whole lot, but Ed Catmull and John Lasseter both loved Disney growing up and aspired to be a part of Disney animation. Now, during the period when Pixar was releasing hit after hit after hit, Disney had not released a single big number one in the box office hit. But as a result of that, and through conversations, this is when Disney purchased Pixar. I believe the sale price was a little over $7 billion. And as a part of that negotiation, Steve Jobs negotiated it. So guess what? It really was in Pixar's favor.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed Catmull and John Lasseter became the heads of Disney Animation and Pixar.
Yep.
The idea being that if you had a centralized leadership across those two, you would not have competition between the two. And also, the idea was that if the leadership from Pixar moved over to the leadership of Disney as a part of that merger, the rituals and the success factors that go into the development of Pixar films, those traditions could remain. That was key to Steve Jobs, and I think brilliant negotiating for him. And they had a success. The merge happened, and this was the first chance that Ed had to apply the principles and the practices that they had at Pixar. They took those to Disney and tried to learn how to incorporate those into Disney animation in an effort to fix Disney. Thus, he terms this a new challenge.
Yeah, and a little bit of background here. So we mentioned a while back with the IPO of Pixar, there was also a detail in there where Steve Jobs renegotiated the deal they had with Disney so that it was a 50-50 split. but Disney owned the rights to the Pixar characters. So
Pixar owned it.
No,
right?
Disney did. They had a group called Circle 7 that
right.
before Bob Iger took over, there was some bad blood between Pixar and Disney, and they were moving ahead with making sequels to the Pixar hits, and they basically didn't need Pixar's okay to do so. They had the legal right to do it, and that was under Michael Eisner. So when Bob Iger takes over and he talks to Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs likes him a lot because I think he was the first one to put TV shows on iTunes. A bunch of the ABC stuff came over. And then Steve Jobs has John Lasseter and Ed Catmull over for dinner, and he's like, hey, so I'm thinking of selling to Disney. And they're both like, what? How could you sell to our mortal enemy?
Yes.
So his advice to them was just go get to know Bob Iger. I think he's a good guy. And to his credits, they mentioned that Steve Jobs said that if they weren't on board with it, he wouldn't go through with the deal. So they got to know Bob Iger. They liked him. And he mentioned that he had been through a successful merger and an unsuccessful one. He wanted to make this a successful one. And basically, we're not doing things right. We want you to come help us out. So John and Ed were the ones basically coming to save Disney culture, which was a challenge because they couldn't just also make a clone of what they had at Pixar. Disney had to kind of evolve into its own thing. They did eventually get there. A lot of this is history. I didn't really care for this section all that much in terms of like stuff that you could apply. Sections 2 and 3 were really the meat of that, in my opinion. But there is some interesting stories here, and they did obviously get to that point where they eventually released Tangled, and that was the first number one hit that they'd had since The Lion King, which was pretty crazy. But they had to make a lot of changes, including how the floor plan was laid out, personnel changes. One of the personnel changes I thought was interesting was this Circle 7 group. The guy who was leading that actually was a pretty bright guy who was just doing his job. So when he met with Ed and John, he wasn't like begging to stay or anything, but they were impressed with this guy and they gave him a pretty high up position.
Yeah.
Even though he was the one in charge of like breaking their babies.
Yep.
So that was kind of cool. And then the other thing here, which maybe we don't need to spend a ton of time in here, but the note stay, I thought this was cool. Because as Pixar is growing and they fix Disney, like the companies continue to grow, they realize basically that they've kind of gotten away from their culture, not because they did anything wrong, but just because it's harder to maintain with new people. They actually experienced, they said, 3 crises at once, where the production costs were rising, the external economic forces were putting pressure on the business, and the cultural tenet that good ideas could come from anywhere was kind of faltering. So just like they have these note stays for their movies, they told everybody, we're going to have this note stay and it's going to be this day. And they set up all these sessions to talk about different things based on the suggestions that they got. And the end result was they had this day where you had people from all over the company, all these different backgrounds, different departments who never interacted really with each other previously. Now we're attending these different sessions. And everybody was encouraged to share their ideas on like basically how do we fix Pixar. And they held Notes Day on March 11th, 2013, and it was a huge success. I really like this idea. I'd like to apply Notes Day to everything I'm involved with. I know that's not going to happen, but I really love this idea and really like the story behind it.
Yeah, this was a piece that it's right towards the end of the book, and when I was reading through, it was like, yes. Like this is yes. Like I want this, and it's because essentially what they're doing is they're making it okay and giving a mechanism for the entire company to shut down for one day and look internally and discuss ways to make themselves better.
Yep.
And when you take a massive crew like the entire company of Pixar and shut it down and say, how do we get better? How do we cut costs? How do we speed up the process of making films? people get excited. Like, wait, you're going to listen to me? Like, I can say something all the way up to the CEO, even though I sweep the floors. Like, this is amazing. And everybody bought in. They built their own wiki pages. They came up with their own like team.
Before Notes Day even happened.
Yeah, before it even happened, weeks before it even happened. They were discussing this amongst each other so that they had better ideas. And it all goes up to leadership, and they use that to continually perfect and improve the company on a whole. It's brilliant. If you really want to know what the details of day-to-day business and how to improve those, talk to the people who live and breathe it every single day. Like, it's just a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and there's a lot in the details of how it was executed that really make it work. Like John Lasseter going on stage at the very beginning and sharing how he received a whole bunch of feedback and it was all compiled, and he thought maybe there would be like a half a page, and it was 2.5 pages.
Yeah.
Of like all the stuff that people didn't like about working with him, you know, and he's like, did I like reading that? No, but it was valuable. And he's like, and I'm asking you to take the same approach. We're not attacking people here. We're attacking the problems with our processes. What was really interesting to me about all of this was they gave people some direction at the very beginning. They mentioned, like, we want to get the number of employee weeks per film, because there's a ton of people that work on these movies, down to something like 18,500.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah, and everybody who was involved with it basically ran with it further than they thought they were going to. And they were like, no, we're going to get it down to 12,000.
Yes.
Which was interesting to me because of the way that it was presented. Because I feel if you were to say, I can envision a very different scenario here where John Lasseter comes out and he says, okay, guys, we've done really well. Pixar is awesome. We've built this place, but it's not sustainable. We got to make some changes. Everybody's going to have to suck it up a little bit, and we got to get this down to here. And how much differently that would have been received, because I've been in those meetings. It sucks. You feel like you have no ownership in the process. You feel like the ship is going down and you're doing what you can to save it, but inevitably this is going to go down anyways. So like, what are we even doing here?
Right.
You know, as opposed to let's reconsider everything. And we know that there are ways that we can do this without just forcing people to work more. Overtime is not the answer, you know? So how do we do this? And obviously the net result was that everybody loved it. Everybody felt like they had a voice. Everybody felt like they were listened to. And I imagine that this had a ripple effect where people were not just doing more work, but more effective work. They were more engaged with their work, I guess would be the term to use here, although that maybe has negative connotations. Like, people were excited to come to work for how many weeks or months after that because they thought that they had been heard.
Right.
You know, you can't put necessarily a dollar sign value on that sort of thing, but it's totally what happens when you do something like this.
After this chapter, this is technically the end of the book right here. There's an afterword and then some starting points that follow that. You mentioned earlier some people may be picking this book up in an effort to learn about Steve Jobs' involvement in Pixar. He does give that to you in not quite 20 pages at the back of the book in this afterward, the Steve we knew. I don't really want to go into that other than it is interesting to see Steve's involvement in the book. And then after that, he has this starting points, thoughts for managing a creative culture. Basically, if you want to start managing a creative culture in the way that they manage Pixar, here's some tips for how to do that. That's what that basically is. I just wanted to point those out quick because if you are reading the book or interested in picking it up, those are a couple pieces that I think are valuable, but I don't really want to go into them a whole lot here.
Yeah, I agree. The Steve Jobs we knew, or the Steve we knew, that chapter, I didn't really care for it all that much. A lot of it was just the people and the nice things that they said at his funeral.
Yeah.
So not a whole lot there. If you really want to study Steve Jobs, the person, go read the Walter Isaacson biography.
Exactly. That's a great biography, by the way. Action items, Mike?
Yes. So I mentioned one of them already, which is to talk about my failures. I did actually have another one in here. We didn't talk about this, but this comes from section 2. Pete Docter he was the director of Up. He has this thing that he does to trick people into considering change.
Right.
Those are his words. And I thought this was brilliant. So he would say things in meetings like, this would be a big change if we were really going to do it, but just as a thought exercise, what if we
Yeah. Yeah.
And I totally get where people, especially people who have created something and they're already like watching the number of hours that they're putting into this thing, they'd be hesitant to completely throw out what they had done and take a different direction. So I think that this is a brilliant tactic to use to get people to think a little bit differently. I don't know specifically where I would use this sort of thing, but I'm definitely putting this in my management leadership toolbox.
Nice. Well, I have 2 down here. One I copied from yours, talk about my failures more often. I'm specifically referring to this in my work context. That's, I feel like, where I could use that the most. 2 is, I'm just curious about this whole Braintrust concept, or maybe something like a notes day, and how that applies to our church in a way of how do or should we use mechanisms and ideas along those to help us improve the church. So I'm probably going to have a couple conversations about that, just because I'm curious what other people think about doing it.
Cool.
There you go. All right, so authors, style, and rating. I'll go first here. I think Ed Catmull is a very easy guy to read. Like his writing style is very easy to read. I love the way he tells stories, which I wouldn't have expected anything less from someone who's so deeply ingrained in a storytelling company. And as a result, this is a tough one to put down. At least I found it hard to put down. But I do think that there's some pieces of it that I'm just not quite sure I wanted there, like Ed Catmull's personal history. Yes, it kind of informs things later on, but I just didn't see how that really fit. There's a number of things that I had a hard time translating, and that's primarily because I don't think that there are a lot of companies that are creative in the sense, like at this scale, like Pixar and Disney, of course. I could see how any sort of big media company could be that way. But I mean, you had a good point earlier too, Mike, about translating things down to like a mastermind group. Maybe there's some strong correlations there, but some of the principles I had a hard time seeing how it applies. I think I'm going to put this at a 4.0 because I really like the book. It's a great read. It is very different for Bookworm, but there are some definite tidbits that we can pull out. But I don't think it's a 5, and I have a few qualms here and there, which makes me wonder about the 4.5, so I'll put it at a 4.0. That's where I land.
All right. Well, as you know, I was skeptical about this one.
Yep.
I did not think that this was going to fit, and when I read the first couple chapters, those fears were confirmed. But something funny happened after that. And by the time I got to chapter 4, and he starts talking about the defining creative principles, Toy Story 2, and everything after that point, I absolutely loved. And then, as I mentioned, the further I went, he does a great job of weaving the things that he's talking about back to those early experiences that he had. It's also kind of interesting because you see the same people popping up over and over again. And one example of that I noticed in the transition and how the story evolved. So he starts off talking about how when he was in New York, when he goes to work with George Lucas, then he's working with Steve Jobs, and kind of his right-hand man through all of that stuff is a guy named Alvy. And then he meets John Lasseter. John Lasseter gets fired from Disney. He comes and works for him, and after a little while, it's not Ed and Alvy anymore. Now it's Ed and John. You don't see that relationship develop, though, unless he tells the stories at the beginning about how he was working with Alvy. And I feel like this story is more about Pixar in general, and you could even argue more about John Lasseter than it is about Ed Catmull.
Right.
By the time you get to the end. So as much as I didn't like that stuff at the beginning, I saw how it all fit at the end, and I don't really have an issue with any of it. I also got way more out of this book than I thought I was going to in terms of not even necessarily action items, though there are a couple of those, but just mindsets that I believe are beneficial and have a very general positive effect with a lot of the things that I'm involved with. So as I finish this book, not only do I put it down and think, wow, I really enjoyed reading that, as I try to quantify like what sort of impact what kind of impact did this book actually have on me, I feel like it's pretty significant. So those things combined, I actually am going to rate this at a 5.
Wow.
Yeah.
Didn't
If
see
you
that
can
coming.
get past the first 4 chapters, which again, there's reasons for that approach, but it's going to feel a little bit weird at the beginning. I feel like there is something in here for anybody, and it's a very entertaining story. Even if you didn't have a growth mindset and you weren't looking for ways to do things better, manage things better, lead things better, you're still going to enjoy the journey. And I really like Ed's style. I really like how it's not all about him. I like how he points out all the mistakes that he's made. And just even like the terminology that he uses, he's like, this was really dumb of me, like that's kind of reassuring because he was obviously very successful. He worked with some very successful people, but I feel like he would be an interesting guy and he would totally be willing to like go grab a coffee. I don't get the feeling reading this like he feels like he's arrived or he's above anybody, if that makes any sense. It feels like a very approachable book.
Yeah. Awesome.
So good pick.
Well, it's a great book. It's a great pick. I really enjoyed it. So what's next, Mike?
Next is Ultra Learning by Scott Young, which I don't know. I can't remember where this came on my radar, but it is one of the more requested books in the Bookworm Club. And it's got a foreword by James Clear. So that's all you need to know.
All right. Following that, I picked up Super Better by Jane McGonigal. The tagline on this is The Power of Living Gamefully. Jane McGonigal is the sister to Kelly McGonigal, The Willpower Instinct, episode number 2, Mike.
There you go.
So we're coming all the way back to, Kelly McGonigal, this is her sister, Jane, who's a big gamer, and she wrote this book as a way to learn how to game real-life challenges and the healing process. I think this would be fun to go through.
Cool.
And since I'm on a knack for picking weird, odd things for Bookworm, here we go again.
All right.
What you got for a Gap book?
My Gap book is a book that I did not hear about until today, but I have ordered it. Will be here tomorrow. That is Tools and Weapons by Brad Smith. Brad Smith is the president, I believe, of Microsoft. This book has a foreword by Bill Gates. The subtitle is The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. So it's probably very much in line with the digital minimalism type stuff that we've read. What was that one a while back? Draining the Shallows, probably along those lines. But the real interesting thing to me about this is that Brad Smith is from Appleton. So that's where I live. And
So it's a local boy.
Yeah, I actually was talking to somebody who knows Brad Smith, and he's like, yeah, I read this book. And I'm like, oh, was it any good? He's like, yeah, it was really good. So local person, local celebrity, maybe? I don't know. And recommendation from a friend of mine. I'm going to go through this one.
Nice. I have The Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McEwen. Breathing, just kind of not something I ever thought I would have an interest in. This was mentioned on a podcast that Brett McKay did for Art of Manliness, and they were talking about the benefits of getting good oxygen into your system. I think it was Brett McKay. And I know that David Allen mentioned it at one point too. So I am very intrigued the oxygen advantage.
All right.
So anyway, that's what's on my plate next. Big thanks to premium members, those of you who are listening in the live piece of this at the moment. The show keeps going because of you guys. So huge thanks to everyone who has supported us through the Bookworm Club memberships. And we'll continue kicking things out for you. So there you go. Thanks, guys.
All right. We talked a lot about candor in this episode. If you want to be candid with us and let us know what you think of the show, you can do that by leaving us an iTunes review. I promise I'll read them. I don't promise I will agree with them, but we do want your feedback.
Love that.
If you are following along with us, pick up Ultra Learning by Scott Young, and we will talk to you in a couple of weeks.